Saturday evenings in New York have their own particular rhythm. I'd learned that over the years, navigating the subway from Brooklyn into Manhattan with my portfolio bag slung over one shoulder and my phone buzzing with last-minute vendor confirmations. Tonight was no different, except for the destination, the Plaza Hotel. Not just any private event, but one hosted by the Valenti family. That name carried weight in certain circles, the kind of weight that made people lower their voices and choose their words carefully. I stood in the grand ballroom 3 hours before guests would arrive, clipboard in hand, watching the floral team position centerpieces on tables draped in champagne-colored linens. Everything had to be perfect. This wasn't my usual corporate anniversary party or engagement celebration. This was a benefit gala for a children's hospital, publicly charitable and privately significant in ways I was beginning to understand. The ice sculptures go on the north side, not blocking the bar access. I called out to the catering manager, a perpetually stressed woman named Denise who'd worked with me on 4 previous events. She nodded, already redirecting her team. My phone showed 6:47 p.m., guests at 8 now. I had exactly 73 minutes to finalize setup, do a full walkthrough, change into my professional black dress that I kept in my bag for these occasions, and position myself near the entrance to handle any last-minute disasters. The life of a freelance event manager meant living in controlled chaos, anticipating problems before they manifested, being invisible when things ran smoothly, and indispensable when they didn't. I'd been doing this for 3 years, ever since graduating with a degree in hospitality management that had cost me $43,000 and counting. The monthly loan payments ate through my income like acid, leaving just barely sufficient for rent on my studio apartment in a Brooklyn neighborhood that real estate agents optimistically called emerging. Every event I booked brought me incrementally closer to financial stability, or at least less suffocating debt. The Valenti contract had come through my website, surprisingly straightforward for such a high-profile family. Monthly events for the next 6 months, starting with tonight's gala. The pay was exceptional, almost too generous, which had made me research them more thoroughly than usual. What I found was carefully curated public information. Real estate holdings throughout New York and New Jersey, restaurant ownership, import businesses, charitable foundations, and beneath that, the whispers, the implications, the kind of business that didn't appear in official records but everyone seemed to know about anyway. I should have declined. Probably. But $43,000 in debt doesn't leave much room for moral high ground, and I told myself I was just coordinating events, not participating in whatever else the family did. "Miss Wells?" A voice behind me, deep and formal. I turned to find a man in his early 50s, silver threading through his dark hair, wearing a suit that fit too perfectly to be off the rack. "I'm Vincent Russo, head of security for the Valenti family. I need to review your vendor list and ensure everyone's been properly vetted." I handed over my tablet, without argument. Security protocols had been more intense for this event than anything I'd previously handled. Background checks on servers, restricted access to certain areas, non-disclosure agreements I'd signed in triplicate. Vincent scrolled through the list with practiced efficiency, his expression revealing nothing. "The family appreciates your professionalism," he said, handing back the tablet. "Mr. Valenti will be arriving shortly. He may want to review the setup personally." "Of course," I replied, though my stomach tightened slightly. Adrian Valenti. I'd seen photographs during my research. Mid-30s, always photographed at charity events or business openings. Never smiling fully. Always with that same measured expression that gave away nothing. Vincent disappeared into the crowd of staff, and I returned to my walkthrough. The string quartet was setting up in the corner. The bar was fully stocked with premium liquor that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery budget. The auction items were displayed on elegant pedestals, each one worth thousands. I was adjusting a floral arrangement that had shifted slightly when the atmosphere in the room changed. It's difficult to explain if you've never experienced it, but there's a particular quality to the air when someone genuinely powerful enters a space. Not celebrity powerful or wealth powerful, but the kind of power that comes from control, from authority that doesn't require announcement. I looked up, and there he was. Adrian Valenti was taller than I'd expected from photographs, maybe 6'2", with a build that suggested he actually used a gym, rather than just maintaining a membership. His hair was dark, styled with the kind of casual precision that required significant effort to appear effortless. He wore a charcoal suit. No tie yet. The collar of his white shirt open in a way that somehow made him look more commanding rather than less formal. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Dark brown, almost black in the ballroom's soft lighting, and they moved across the space with systematic thoroughness. He wasn't just looking around, he was cataloging, assessing, noting every detail and every person. Those eyes passed over me without pausing, and I felt strangely dismissed, which was ridiculous. I was the event coordinator, functionally part of the furniture. Being invisible was part of the job description. Adrian spoke quietly to Vincent, who'd materialized beside him, then began walking the perimeter of the ballroom. I tried to focus on my own tasks, checking that the registration table had sufficient programs, confirming with Denise that the kitchen timing was on schedule. "You're the coordinator." Not a question. I turned to find Adrian standing 3 feet away, and I hadn't heard him approach. Up close, he was even more imposing, not through aggression but through sheer presence. "Yes, sir." "Claire Wells. Is there something you need adjusted before guests arrive?" His gaze moved past me to scan the room again. The auction table positioning blocks sight lines from the main entrance. Shift it 6 feet west. I followed his line of sight and realized he was right. Someone entering would have to navigate around the displays to reach the main floor. "I'll have it moved immediately. The floral budget was generous. You chose well." He said it without looking at me, already turning away. "Thank you," I managed. But he was already walking toward the kitchen entrance with Vincent, presumably to review security protocols there as well. I directed the display team to reposition the auction table, my hands slightly unsteady. There'd been something unsettling about that brief interaction. The way he'd assessed the space with such precision. The way he'd noted my floral choices in a tone that suggested he actually understood design, rather than just making polite conversation. By 7:45, I'd changed into my black dress and positioned myself near the registration area. Guests began arriving exactly at 8. A steady stream of elegantly dressed people who moved through the space with the confidence of those accustomed to wealth and influence. I recognized several faces from New York social pages, a few local politicians, business owners whose names appeared regularly in the financial news, and I watched Adrian Valenti work the room. He moved with calculated grace, stopping at specific tables, shaking hands with people who seemed genuinely pleased to see him, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear from my position. But there was something studied about it, a performance that he executed flawlessly, while remaining somehow separate from it all. Even when he smiled, even when he appeared relaxed, there was a watchfulness to him that never quite faded. Around 9:30, I was coordinating the transition from cocktail hour to dinner service when I heard raised voices from near the bar. Not shouting, but the kind of intense, quiet argument that's actually more threatening than volume. I moved closer, trying to appear like I was checking on the bartenders while actually listening. Adrian stood with another man, probably late 40s, expensive suit, face flushed with either anger or alcohol or both. "The Bronx territories were negotiated 2 years ago," the man was saying, voice low but harsh. "You can't just... This isn't the venue for business discussions," Adrian interrupted, his tone colder than I'd heard it before. "We'll address your concerns through appropriate channels." "Your father would have..." "My father isn't here." Adrian's voice dropped even lower, and something in his posture shifted in a way that made my survival instincts scream warning. "And you'll show respect, or you'll leave. Choose now." The other man's jaw worked, but he nodded once and turned away, disappearing into the crowd with visible effort at composure. I should have moved, should have returned to my coordination duties and pretended I'd heard nothing. But I was frozen, watching Adrian's profile as he took a controlled breath and reset his expression back to pleasant neutrality. Then he turned, and his eyes met mine across the 15 feet that separated us. 3 seconds. That's how long he looked at me. Really looked at me, with an intensity that made my breath catch. His expression was unreadable, calculating, assessing in a way that felt invasive despite the distance. Then his gaze moved past me as if I hadn't existed at all, and he rejoined a group of guests near the auction displays. I forced myself to move, to breathe, to return to the logistics that required my attention. The dinner service progressed smoothly. The auction raised an impressive amount for the children's hospital. By midnight, guests were departing with genuine satisfaction, and I was overseeing the breakdown process. Miss Wells, Vincent appeared beside me again. Mr. Valenti asked me to confirm your availability for next month's event. Private dinner gathering, Manhattan location to be determined. Yes, I have it on my calendar. 50 guests, formal service. 40 guests, he corrected. The scope changed this afternoon. Updated details will be sent to your email by Monday. I nodded, making a note on my tablet. Vincent studied me for a moment with the same assessing expression I'd seen on Adrian earlier. You handled tonight well, he said finally. Discretion is appreciated in our organization. It took me a second to understand. The conversation I'd witnessed, the territorial dispute I'd overheard. He was confirming that I understood the unspoken rule. See nothing, hear nothing, remember nothing. I'm just here to coordinate events, I replied carefully. Everything else is none of my business. Something that might have been approval crossed Vincent's face. Good. We'll be in touch. The next 6 weeks fell into a pattern. I coordinated 3 more events for the Valenti organization, each one slightly different in scope and venue, but all carrying that same undercurrent of power and careful control. A private dinner at a restaurant in Queens that the family apparently owned. A business reception at a gallery space in Manhattan. A birthday celebration for someone's mother at an estate in Long Island. Adrian appeared at each one, always accompanied by Vincent and several other men who radiated the same quiet danger. He rarely spoke to me directly, just the occasional comment about setup or a brief nod of approval when service ran smoothly. But I noticed him. Couldn't help noticing him, really. The way you notice a storm building on the horizon. The way he never sat with his back to an entrance. The way his attention constantly scanned the room, cataloging threats and anomalies. The way he would sometimes pause in conversation, his gaze finding me across whatever space we occupied, lingering for just a moment before moving on. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that I was projecting significance onto random glances because my life had become so consumed by work and debt that I'd started looking for narrative where none existed. My days blurred together, coordinating events, meeting with vendors, updating spreadsheets that tracked my loan payments with depressing precision. My studio apartment in Brooklyn felt increasingly claustrophobic, filled with sample centerpieces and fabric swatches and the constant buzz of my phone with vendor questions and client requests. I had no social life to speak of. The few friends from college had drifted away, their lives progressing toward marriages and career advancement, while I remained stuck in survival mode. My last relationship had ended almost a year ago, killed by my inability to prioritize anything beyond work and debt repayment. This was my life. This was all I could manage, and I'd accepted that with something resembling peace, until the private dinner in Soho changed everything. The venue was an upscale Italian restaurant that apparently closed for private events when the Valenti family requested it. 30 guests, intimate setting, wine pairings that cost more than my monthly rent. I'd spent the afternoon coordinating with the chef and ensuring the floral arrangements matched the sophisticated ambiance. Guests arrived at 7, and I recognized most of them from previous events. The usual rotation of business associates and family connections. I was reviewing the wine service timing with the sommelier when someone new walked through the entrance. He was maybe 32. Blonde hair styled perfectly, wearing a navy suit that had definitely been tailored specifically for him. Handsome in a polished, practiced way, with an easy confidence that came from wealth and privilege. He checked in at the host stand, was greeted warmly by Vincent, and moved into the reception area where cocktails were being served. And then he noticed me. "You look far too stressed for such a beautiful evening," he said, approaching with a wine glass in hand, and that easy smile firmly in place. "Please tell me you're not working this event." "I'm coordinating it, actually," I replied, keeping my tone professional but not unfriendly. "Is there something you need?" "Just conversation with the most interesting person in the room." He extended his hand. "Julian Hale, Claire Wells." I shook his hand briefly. But I really do need to finish coordinating the service timing, so 5 minutes, he interrupted, not aggressively but persistently. Tell me how someone ends up coordinating events for the Valenti family. That seems like a position that requires either tremendous talent or tremendous courage. Despite myself, I smiled. Probably more desperation than either of those. Julian laughed, genuine and warm. Honesty. I appreciate that. He moved to stand beside me, both of us now facing the room rather than each other. I'm guessing student loans and New York rent? Is it that obvious? I recognized the expression. I had it for 2 years after business school before my consulting firm finally took off. He sipped his wine. Although I'm guessing event coordination doesn't quite pay at consulting rates. Not remotely, I admitted, surprised at how easy conversation felt with him. But it's what I'm good at. And the Valenti contract is helping me actually make progress on the debt. We talked for another few minutes, his questions feeling genuinely interested rather than invasive. He was charming in a way that felt natural, not performed, asking about my work and actually listening to the answers. I was explaining the logistics of coordinating vendors across multiple boroughs when I felt it. That particular quality to the air that I'd learned to recognize. I glanced toward the main dining area and found Adrian Valenti standing near the bar, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his attention fixed directly on Julian and me. His expression was controlled, carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight, and his free hand was clenched into a fist at his side. It was the first time I'd seen him display genuine emotion, and something about the intensity in his dark eyes made my pulse quicken. Julian followed my gaze, then turned back with a knowing look. I should probably let you get back to work before your client decides I'm being inappropriate. He's not... I started, then stopped because I didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. I do need to coordinate the dinner service, then have dinner with me instead. Tomorrow night, somewhere that doesn't require you to coordinate anything except your own enjoyment. I hesitated. I hadn't been on an actual date in months. Hadn't had time or energy for anything beyond work and survival. But Julian seemed kind, genuinely interested, and it had been so long since someone had looked at me like I was more than just a service provider or debt statistic. Okay, I heard myself say. Tomorrow night. Julian's face lit up. Perfect. I'll text you details. He paused. I'm assuming you'll need my number for that to work. I pulled out my phone, and we exchanged contact information. He squeezed my hand gently before moving back toward the other guests, rejoining a conversation near the windows. I turned toward the dining area to check on the service timing, and my gaze collided with Adrian's again. He was still watching, still displaying that barely controlled tension that seemed completely at odds with his usual calculated composure. Then Vincent appeared beside him, murmuring something, and Adrian's attention finally shifted away. But something had changed in the atmosphere. Some invisible line had been crossed, and I had no idea what it meant. The dinner service went flawlessly. Guests departed satisfied. I coordinated the breakdown and confirmed next month's event details with Vincent. And all the while, I was aware of Adrian's presence, the way he moved through the evening with that same watchful intensity, the way his eyes found me in the crowd before quickly looking away. I told myself I was imagining significance where none existed, that a powerful man had simply noticed his event coordinator talking to a guest, nothing more. But as I rode the subway back to Brooklyn at midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Julian confirming our dinner plans, and I couldn't shake the memory of Adrian's expression, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched, the first real emotion I'd ever seen him display, and it had been directed at me. Julian texted me the next morning with restaurant suggestions, each one more upscale than the last. We settled on a place in Tribeca, the kind of establishment where reservations required weeks of advance notice unless you knew someone who knew someone. Apparently, Julian knew someone. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit born from years of event coordination, and found him already seated at a corner table with excellent sightlines to the rest of the dining room. He stood when he saw me, genuine warmth in his expression, and pulled out my chair before the server could reach us. "You look incredible," he said, and I was grateful I'd splurged on a new dress, navy blue silk that I justified as a business expense even though I knew it wasn't. Dinner was effortless in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Julian asked about my background, my education, how I'd ended up in event management. I found myself talking about my student loans with more honesty than I'd intended, the weight of $43,000 in debt that shaped every financial decision I made. "That's admirable," he said, swirling wine in his glass. "Most people in New York just accept debt as permanent background noise. You're actually fighting it. I don't have much choice. The interest alone is suffocating. Still, it shows character." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. "Most of the women I meet in this city are either trust fund beneficiaries or climbing corporate ladders with ruthless efficiency. You're refreshingly real." I should have recognized the flattery for what it was, the practiced charm of someone who knew exactly which words to deploy. But I was lonely, had been lonely for longer than I wanted to acknowledge, and Julian's attention felt like sunlight after months of gray winter. We started seeing each other regularly after that. Dinner twice a week, always at restaurants I could never afford on my own. He sent flowers to my apartment, beautiful arrangements that must have cost hundreds of dollars. He texted throughout the day, asking about my work, my stress levels, whether I was eating properly. It felt like being cared for, and I'd been taking care of myself alone for so long that I'd forgotten how seductive that could be. 3 weeks into whatever we were building, I coordinated another Valenti event. This one was at a private gallery in the Upper East Side, a charity auction benefiting arts education programs. Smaller guest list, more intimate setting, with paintings worth more than my entire year's income displayed on pristine white walls. I was reviewing the silent auction catalog with the gallery owner when Julian walked through the entrance. I hadn't known he was invited, hadn't connected him to the Valenti social circle, and surprise must have shown on my face because he grinned as he approached. "Didn't mention I'd be here," he said, kissing my cheek in greeting. "Wanted to see you in your element without giving you time to stress about mixing personal and professional." "I'm working," I protested, but without much conviction. "I can't just abandon my responsibilities to socialize." "I know. I'll be a perfect guest and won't distract you at all." He squeezed my hand. "But maybe we can grab a late dinner after this wraps up." I agreed, and he moved into the main gallery space where guests were already gathering for cocktails and preliminary viewings of the auction items. I tried to focus on my coordination duties, confirming that the catering timeline was on schedule, ensuring the auction software was functioning correctly, coordinating with the auctioneer about lot sequencing. But I was aware of Julian moving through the crowd, charming and confident, fitting seamlessly into this world of wealth and influence, and I was aware of Adrian Valenti watching from near the bar. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, accompanied as always by Vincent and 2 other men whose names I'd never learned. Tonight he wore a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, his white shirt open at the collar in that same way that somehow made him appear more commanding rather than casual. But it was his expression that caught my attention. Gone was the usual careful neutrality, the controlled composure I'd seen at every previous event. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense, and his dark eyes tracked Julian's movements with an intensity that felt almost predatory. When Julian returned to where I stood coordinating the transition from cocktails to auction, when he kissed me properly this time with affection and possession, I felt Adrian's gaze like a physical weight. I glanced toward the bar, and our eyes met across the 30 feet separating us. His expression was unreadable, but loaded with something I couldn't identify. Anger, maybe, or assessment. Vincent leaned close, murmuring something I couldn't hear, and Adrian responded without breaking eye contact with me, his voice too low to carry, but his body language radiating controlled fury. Then he turned away, rejoining a conversation with several guests near one of the more expensive paintings, and I was left feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't articulate. The auction proceeded smoothly, raising an impressive total for the arts program. Julian bid on and won a small abstract piece that he immediately gifted to me, insisting it would look perfect in my apartment, even though we both knew my studio had no wall space for artwork. It was a sweet gesture, romantic and thoughtful, and I tried to focus on that, rather than the weight of Adrian's attention every time I looked up. Guests began departing around 11, and I was coordinating with the catering team about breakdown procedures when one of Adrian's security personnel appeared beside me. Not Vincent, someone I hadn't interacted with before, younger, but carrying the same aura of controlled danger. "Miss Wells, Mr. Valenti would like to speak with you." "There's a private office on the second floor." My stomach tightened. "I'm in the middle of coordinating." "Now, please." Not aggressive, but absolutely not a request. I glanced toward where Julian was examining his newly acquired painting, then followed the security guard up a narrow staircase to the gallery's administrative level. He led me to a closed door, knocked twice, then opened it and gestured me inside before disappearing back down the stairs. The office was small, elegant, with a desk and chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan street below. Adrian stood near those windows, his back to me, hands in his pockets, posture deceptively relaxed. "You wanted to see me?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. He turned, and the intensity in his expression made me take an involuntary step back. His dark eyes locked onto mine with a focus that felt invasive, assessing in a way that went far beyond our previous minimal interactions. "Julian Hale," he said, voice controlled but carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Tell me about your relationship with him." "I don't see how that's any of your business." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, defensive and confused. "Answer the question, Miss Wells. He's my boyfriend. We've been seeing each other for a few weeks. Is there a problem with a guest at your event? Or are you just—" "He works for the Carbone organization." Adrian moved away from the window, closing the distance between us with predatory grace. "Do you know what that means?" I did vaguely. The Carbone family was another name that carried weight in certain circles, another organization that occupied the same shadowy space as the Valentis. Rivals, if the whispered conversations I'd overheard were accurate. "That doesn't have anything to do with me," I said, but uncertainty crept into my voice. "He's using you." Adrian stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, the tension in his jaw, extracting information about our events, dates, locations, guest lists, security protocols. "You're his access point. That's ridiculous. Julian doesn't ask about." But even as I said it, I was remembering small questions that had seemed like normal interest. When was my next event? Who typically attended Valenti gatherings? What venues did the family prefer? "Why would you even care?" I demanded, anger replacing confusion. "This seems personal, not professional. Are you jealous that someone showed interest in your event coordinator?" Something flashed in Adrian's expression, too quick to identify. "This has nothing to do with jealousy, and everything to do with your safety. The Carbone organization doesn't pursue relationships for romance, Miss Wells. They pursue them for intelligence. You don't know anything about Julian or what we have." I turned toward the door. "I'm done with this conversation." "Claire." The use of my first name stopped me. He'd never called me anything but Miss Wells. "Be careful. That's all I'm asking." I left without responding, my hands shaking with anger and confusion and something else I didn't want to examine. Downstairs, Julian was waiting by the entrance, my new painting carefully wrapped and held under his arm. "Everything okay?" he asked, noting my expression. "You look upset." "Just coordination stress. I'm fine." I forced a smile. "Ready for that late dinner?" We went to another upscale restaurant, and Julian was his usual charming self. But now I couldn't stop analyzing our conversation. He asked about next month's Valenti event, wanting to know if it was confirmed yet, where it would be held, whether the guest list would be similar to tonight's. "Why do you want to know?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Just making conversation. I enjoy these events. The people are interesting." He smiled, easy and practiced. "Plus, it gives me excuses to see you while you're working, even if I can't monopolize your attention." It was a reasonable answer. Perfectly logical. So why did Adrian's warning echo in my mind? Over the next 2 weeks, I paid closer attention. Julian continued being attentive, continued sending flowers and planning elaborate dates, but he also continued asking questions, subtle but persistent, about the Valenti organization's social calendar. "Who else typically attends these dinners?" he'd ask while we were having drinks. I recognized several faces from finance and real estate. Does the family have specific business connections they're cultivating? Are the venues always in Manhattan? Or do they spread throughout the boroughs? He wondered while we were walking through Central Park. I'm just curious about their geographic preferences. You must coordinate security protocols with Vincent, right? That must be complicated, making sure everyone's vetted properly. Individually, each question seemed innocent. Collectively, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks after Adrian's warning, I arranged to meet Julian at a cafe in the West Village, neutral territory away from the upscale restaurants he always chose. He arrived with his usual confident smile, kissing me in greeting and ordering an expensive espresso like he owned the place. I need to ask you something, I said, keeping my voice level. And I need you to be honest with me. Of course. What's wrong? Why do you ask so many questions about my work with the Valenti family? His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. I don't understand. I ask about your work because I'm interested in your life. You ask specifically about events, dates, locations, attendees, security protocols. I watched his face carefully. It's not normal interest, Julian. It's interrogation disguised as conversation. That's paranoid. He laughed, but it sounded forced. Has someone been telling you things about me? Let me guess. Valenti himself? He probably doesn't like that you're dating someone outside his control. This isn't about Adrian. This is about you, and why you're really interested in me. I'm interested in you, because you're intelligent and beautiful and real in a city full of artificial people. Julian reached for my hand across the table. Whatever Valenti said to you, he's trying to manipulate you. Can't you see that? I pulled my hand back. Who do you work for, Julian? Really? His jaw tightened, and for just a second, his carefully maintained mask slipped. I saw calculation in his expression, cold assessment that had nothing to do with romance or affection. I work in consulting. I've told you that. But his tone had hardened, defensive in a way that confirmed my suspicions. We're done, I said, standing from the table. Don't contact me again. Claire, you're making a mistake. Goodbye, Julian. I walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding, half expecting him to follow. But when I glanced back from the corner, he was still sitting at our table, his expression dark and furious. The charming mask completely gone. I spent the next 3 days in a fog of anger and humiliation. Adrian had been right. Julian had used me, cultivated a relationship solely to extract information about the Valenti organization. Every dinner, every gift, every sweet text message had been strategic manipulation. I threw away the flowers he'd sent, donated the dresses he'd bought me, tried to scrub away the memory of his touch and his lies. My apartment felt simultaneously too empty and too full of reminders. On the 3rd day after our breakup, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. Me, leaving my apartment building in Brooklyn. Timestamp from that morning. My blood went cold. Another text arrived. Another photo. Me exiting the subway near a client's office in Manhattan. Yesterday's date. Then another. Me walking into a vendor meeting in Queens. From 2 days ago. Someone had been following me, documenting my movements, building a file of my daily patterns and routines. A 4th text arrived. This one with words. You made a very poor decision. I stared at my phone, hands shaking, trying to process the implications. Julian hadn't just been gathering intelligence about events. He'd been gathering intelligence about me, my life, my vulnerabilities. And now he, or someone working with him, was making sure I knew they were watching. I sat on my bed in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, looking at the photos that proved I'd been under surveillance for days, possibly weeks, and realized with crystalline clarity that Adrian's warning had been more serious than I'd understood. This wasn't just about business rivalry or stolen event information. This was about power and territory, and the kind of danger I'd been naive enough to think wouldn't touch me as long as I just coordinated events and minded my own business. I pulled up the contact information I had for the Valenti organization, the number I used for event coordination, and stared at it for a long moment. Calling for help meant acknowledging I was in over my head, meant admitting I'd ignored warnings I should have heeded, meant entering further into a world I'd tried to stay peripheral to. But the alternative was facing whatever Julian and the Carbone organization had planned with no protection and no resources. My finger hovered over the call button, and I made a choice that would change everything. I pressed the call button before I could second-guess myself. The phone rang 3 times before a professional male voice answered with just, "Yes? This is Claire Wells. I coordinate events for the Valenti family. I need to speak with someone about a security concern. Hold, please." The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then Vincent's familiar voice came through. "All business. Miss Wells, explain the situation." I did, my words tumbling out faster than I intended. The breakup with Julian, the photos that had started arriving, the surveillance that proved I'd been followed for days. Vincent listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his response was immediate. "Stay in your apartment. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except our people. We'll be there within 2 hours. I can handle this myself. Maybe I should just call the police." "The police can't help you with this." His tone left no room for argument. 2 hours, Miss Wells. "Stay inside." The call ended, and I was left staring at my phone, wondering if I'd just made everything worse, or finally done something right. Those 2 hours were the longest of my life. I paced my studio apartment, which suddenly felt too small and too exposed. The windows faced the street, offering a clear view to anyone watching from below. I pulled the curtains closed, then worried that the change in routine would signal something to whoever was surveilling me. My phone stayed silent. No more photos, no more texts. But somehow that felt more ominous than continued harassment. Exactly 1 hour and 53 minutes after my call to Vincent, someone knocked on my door. 3 sharp raps, professional and controlled. "Miss Wells, we're with Valenti Security." I looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits, both carrying themselves with that same alert readiness I'd seen in Vincent. One held up an identification card that looked official, but told me nothing useful. "I'm not opening the door," I called through the wood. "How do I know you're actually—" My phone buzzed with a text from Vincent's number. "2 men at your door, Marcus and Leo. Let them in." I unlocked the door with shaking hands, and the 2 men entered with swift efficiency, immediately checking the apartment's small bathroom and single closet before positioning themselves by the windows. "Pack a bag," the one who'd identified himself as Marcus said. "Enough for a week. We're moving you to a secure location. I'm not going anywhere until someone explains what's happening." "Ma'am, we don't have time for explanations. There are people watching this building who want to hurt you. We need to move now." "Then I'm calling the police." I pulled out my phone, dialing 911, letting them see me do it. If this was legitimate protection, they'd understand my caution. If it wasn't, at least I'd have tried. Marcus exchanged a glance with Leo, then pulled out a tablet and brought up a series of photographs. "Before you complete that call, look at these." The images showed Julian standing outside my building with 3 other men. One of them was holding something that looked distinctly like a weapon under his jacket. The timestamp was from 40 minutes ago. "We intercepted communications about a planned extraction tonight," Marcus continued, his voice gentler now. "They're waiting for our surveillance to leave. If you stay here, you become a hostage. If you come with us, Mr. Valenti can keep you safe while we deal with the Carbone situation." I stared at the photos, my hand still hovering over my phone's screen. The 911 dispatcher's voice came through, tinny and distant. "911, what's your emergency?" "I'm sorry, false alarm," I managed, ending the call. "Smart choice," Leo said from his position by the window. "We need to leave through the service entrance, now. I have work commitments, events scheduled for this week. I can't just disappear." Even as I said it, I knew how absurd it sounded given the circumstances. "Make your calls from the car," Marcus said. "You have 5 minutes to pack." I grabbed my largest bag and filled it with clothes, toiletries, my laptop, chargers. My hands were moving automatically while my mind struggled to process what was happening. This morning I'd been a freelance event coordinator with student loan debt and a failed relationship. Now I was fleeing my apartment with armed security because a criminal organization wanted to kidnap me. The trip down the service stairs and out the back entrance passed in a blur. They'd positioned a black SUV in the alley, and I was in the back seat before I'd fully registered leaving my building. Marcus drove while Leo sat beside me, his attention constantly scanning the streets we passed. "Make your calls," Marcus said from the front. "Tell your clients you have a family emergency out of state. Be vague but apologetic. I spent the next 20 minutes canceling or rescheduling everything I had booked for the coming week. 3 events, 2 vendor meetings, a consultation with a potential new client who'd specifically requested my services. Each call felt like watching pieces of my carefully constructed life crumble. "I'm so sorry. Something urgent came up with family," I repeated over and over, inventing a sick aunt in Boston, an emergency that required my immediate presence. Most were understanding, a few were frustrated, and one client implied I was unprofessional and unreliable. I apologized again and ended the call feeling hollow. "Where are we going?" I asked when the last call was complete. "The Hamptons. Mr. Valenti has a property there that's secure and isolated. You'll be safe while we handle the situation." The Hamptons. I'd coordinated events there before, had seen the kind of wealth that could afford oceanfront estates and private security, but I'd never imagined being taken to one as a refugee, leaving behind my entire life because I'd been stupid enough to date the wrong person. The drive took over 2 hours, traffic thinning as we left the city behind. My phone buzzed occasionally with texts from clients and vendors, questions about rescheduled dates and logistics that suddenly seemed impossibly distant from my current reality. We finally turned off the main road onto a private drive marked only by a small security station. The guard recognized the vehicle and waved us through without question. The property that emerged from behind tall hedges was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow worse. Massive stone mansion, manicured lawns, enough security cameras to film a documentary, and men positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. This wasn't protection. This was a fortress. Marcus parked near the main entrance, and we were met by Vincent, who'd apparently arrived ahead of us. His expression was professionally neutral, but I saw concern in the tightness around his eyes. "Miss Wells, I apologize for the abrupt relocation, but the threat was credible and immediate." "Where's Adrian?" I demanded, anger finally breaking through shock. "If he's going to upend my life, he can explain it to my face." "Mr. Valenti is inside. He's been handling the situation since your call." Vincent gestured toward the entrance. "If you'll follow me." The interior of the mansion was somehow both elegant and austere. Expensive furniture, original artwork, but nothing personal or warm. It felt like a showroom or a high-end hotel. Beautiful, but empty of actual life. Adrian stood in what appeared to be a study, phone to his ear, his free hand gesturing sharply as he spoke in rapid Italian. He noticed our entrance and wrapped up his conversation with curt efficiency, setting the phone down and turning to face me with that same controlled intensity I'd seen at the gallery. "Claire, I'm glad you're safe." "Safe?" My voice came out higher than intended. "I've been forced to abandon my apartment, cancel a week of work, and get driven to the Hamptons by armed men because I made the mistake of trusting someone you warned me about. So forgive me if I don't feel particularly safe right now." "You're alive," Adrian said, his tone maddeningly calm. "If you'd stayed in Brooklyn, that wouldn't be guaranteed." "Explain. Actually explain what's happening, because I deserve more than vague warnings and security theater." Adrian exchanged a glance with Vincent, then gestured to the leather chairs positioned near the study's fireplace. "Sit. This will take some time." I remained standing, arms crossed, too angry and frightened to accept the pretense of casual conversation. Adrian sighed but didn't push, instead moving to lean against his desk. "Julian Hale is an operative for the Carbone organization. We've known about him for several months, tracked his movements, monitored his communications. When he targeted you, we understood immediately what they were planning." "Planning what, exactly?" "Extraction. Kidnapping, though they wouldn't have used that word. The plan was to take you, use you as leverage to force access to our events and social gatherings. You would have been held until your usefulness expired." The casual way he described my potential fate made my stomach lurch. "And then what?" "After my usefulness expired," Adrian's jaw tightened, and he didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Why me?" I asked, hating how my voice shook. "I'm just an event coordinator. I'm nobody. You're someone I employed. Someone who had access to information about our organization's social calendar, security protocols, key personnel." Adrian's dark eyes locked onto mine. "And you're someone Julian thought he could manipulate." He was partially right. The accusation stung because it was accurate. I had been manipulated, had ignored warnings because I'd been lonely, and Julian had been charming. How long do I have to stay here? Until we've neutralized the threat. Could be days, could be weeks. Weeks? I turned to Vincent. I have a business. Clients who depend on me. I can't just disappear for weeks. You don't have a choice, Adrian said. And something in his tone made me spin back to face him. This isn't a negotiation, Claire. You're involved now, whether you wanted to be or not. You can stay here, under protection, and remain alive. Or you can go back to Brooklyn and become a target that we can't adequately defend. Choose. That's not a choice. That's an ultimatum. Yes, he agreed simply. It is. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to break the carefully controlled atmosphere of this conversation. Instead, I sank into one of the leather chairs and dropped my face into my hands. I didn't ask for any of this. I know. Adrian's voice softened slightly. But it happened anyway. And now we deal with reality, not preferences. Vincent showed me to a bedroom on the second floor, spacious and elegantly appointed with its own bathroom, and a view of the ocean that would have been breathtaking if I weren't too angry and frightened to appreciate it. There's secure internet access in the study, he said, but usage is monitored and limited for security purposes. Mr. Valenti asks that you avoid posting on social media or communicating your location to anyone. So, I'm a prisoner. You're a guest under protection, Vincent corrected. There's a significant difference. After he left, I sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 6 hours. This morning I'd woken up in my own apartment, worried about vendor contracts and client satisfaction. Now I was locked in a mansion in the Hamptons, my life suspended indefinitely because I'd become collateral damage in a war between criminal organizations. I pulled out my laptop and tried to work, responding to the emails that had accumulated, attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But concentration was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow outside the window felt threatening. The days that followed blurred together. I stayed mostly in my room or the study, trying to work remotely with the limited internet access Vincent had mentioned. My clients were understanding to varying degrees, some annoyed by my sudden absence, others concerned about my fabricated family emergency. Adrian appeared occasionally, always accompanied by Vincent or other security personnel, always maintaining that same professional distance. He'd ask if I needed anything, if the accommodations were sufficient, if I was managing the work disruption. But there was tension beneath his formal concern, something I couldn't identify but felt nonetheless. I noticed things about him during those brief interactions. The way he never sat with his back to a door or window. The way his attention constantly tracked movement and sound. The way exhaustion showed in subtle lines around his eyes that hadn't been visible at the events I'd coordinated. He was carrying the weight of whatever conflict was happening with the Carbone organization, and my protection was apparently part of that burden. On the 5th night, a storm rolled in from the ocean. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, listening to rain hammer against the windows when I heard raised voices from somewhere below. Not shouting, but the kind of intense, controlled argument that's actually more unsettling than volume. I shouldn't have investigated. Should have stayed in my room and maintained the pretense of not being curious about the organization protecting me. But 6 days of isolation had eroded my better judgment, and I found myself creeping down the hallway toward the source of the voices. The study door was partially open, and through the gap I could see Adrian standing near the fireplace, Vincent facing him with unusual tension in his posture. "This is consuming resources we need elsewhere," Vincent was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "She's one person, Christopher. One civilian who got caught up in something she shouldn't have. Meanwhile, we have actual operations being delayed, personnel tied up on babysitting duty, and the Carbone situation escalating because we're distracted. She's under my personal protection," Adrian responded, his voice dropping to a register I'd never heard before. Cold, absolute, carrying an authority that made me instinctively step back from the door. "That's not open for discussion. With respect, why? She's your event coordinator, nothing more. Why are you allocating this level of attention and security to someone who isn't family, isn't connected to our operations in any meaningful way?" Vincent. Just his name, but loaded with warning. I'm serious, Adrian. Your father would never have... My father isn't here. The temperature in Adrian's voice dropped even further. And you'll stop questioning my decisions about her protection. Or you'll find yourself reassigned to inventory management in New Jersey. Are we clear? A long silence. Then Vincent's reply, subdued. Clear. Good. Now get an update from Marcus about the surveillance on Carbone's Midtown operation. I want to know everyone who's entered that building in the past 48 hours. I heard footsteps approaching the door and barely made it back to the staircase before Vincent emerged, his expression dark and troubled. He didn't notice me pressed against the shadows, just headed toward another part of the house with his phone already to his ear. I returned to my room, heart pounding, Adrian's words echoing in my mind. Personal protection. Not just organizational obligation or professional courtesy, but something that belonged specifically to him. What did that mean? And why did the intensity in his voice when he'd said it make something in my chest tighten with an emotion I wasn't ready to examine? The storm continued through the night, and I lay awake processing the conversation I'd overheard, trying to understand what I'd become to Adrian Valenti and why it terrified me as much as the threat I was supposedly being protected from. The days stretched longer than I thought possible. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since I'd arrived at the Hamptons mansion, and the isolation was beginning to fracture something inside me. I worked remotely when the limited internet access allowed, maintained my business relationships through carefully worded emails, and pretended everything was fine while my life remained suspended in this gilded cage. But Adrian had started appearing more frequently. Not just the brief check-ins with Vincent hovering nearby, but actual time spent in my presence. Dinners in the mansion's formal dining room, just the two of us at opposite ends of a table that could seat 20. Conversations that went beyond logistics and security updates. How did you end up in event management? He asked one evening, swirling wine in his glass with practiced ease. Student loans needed paying. I answered, the familiar bitterness creeping into my voice. $43,000 doesn't disappear on its own, and event coordination was something I was good at. What about you? How does someone become head of a family organization at 36? His expression darkened slightly. Necessity. My father died when I was 28. The transition wasn't optional. That's young to inherit that much responsibility. Young, unprepared, and surrounded by people waiting to see if I'd fail. He set down his glass. Some of them are still waiting. There was vulnerability in that admission, a crack in the carefully maintained facade he showed the world. I found myself leaning forward, genuinely curious about the man behind the controlled exterior. Do you regret it? Taking over? Every day. And never. Adrian's dark eyes met mine across the distance separating us. It's not a choice you make once. It's a choice you make every morning when you wake up and decide to carry the weight for one more day. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. The weight of debt, of survival, of building a life from nothing, while fighting against forces that wanted to drag you back down. We came from completely different worlds, but the exhaustion of constant vigilance was something we apparently shared. Over the following days, these conversations became routine. We'd eat dinner together, talk about everything and nothing, and I'd slowly learn pieces of Adrian Valenti that didn't match the cold, calculating dawn I'd observed at events. He read voraciously, shelves in his study filled with everything from philosophy to historical biographies. He spoke 4 languages fluently and was learning a 5th. He'd wanted to be an architect before his father's death had redirected his entire life trajectory. And he'd lost someone. A sister. He finally told me on the 9th night, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of old grief. Gabriella was 21. Bright, studying pre-law at Columbia, full of plans to change the world through legitimate means. Adrian stared into the fireplace, flames casting shifting shadows across his face. A rival organization wanted to send a message. They took her from campus, held her for 3 days while making demands. I was trying to negotiate, trying to find a solution that didn't risk her life. What happened? I wasn't fast enough. His jaw clenched. By the time we located where they were holding her, she was already gone. They'd never intended to return her alive. The negotiation was theater, designed to make me feel complicit in her death. Adrian, that wasn't your fault. wasn't it?" He turned to look at me, and the pain in his expression was raw and unguarded. I knew the risks, knew what being connected to this family meant, but I let her stay in New York, let her believe she could have a normal life if she just stayed peripheral to the business. I was wrong, and she paid for my miscalculation. The connection to my situation was obvious, and I felt a chill run through me. "Is that why you're protecting me? Because I remind you of her?" "No." The answer was immediate and sharp. Gabriella was family, innocent, caught in something she never chose. "You're different." "How?" But he stood abruptly, the moment of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. "It's late. You should rest." I wanted to push, to demand he finish that thought, but he was already leaving the dining room, and I was left with more questions than answers. The tension between us had been building for days, simmering beneath every conversation and shared meal. I felt it in the way his gaze would linger on me before he looked away, in the careful distance he maintained even when we were alone, in the controlled precision of every word he spoke in my presence. On the 13th night, a storm system moved in from the Atlantic. I could hear rain beginning to fall as I tried to work in the study, reviewing vendor contracts that felt increasingly irrelevant to my current reality. The familiar tasks couldn't distract me from the growing frustration that had been building since I'd arrived. I was a prisoner here. No matter how comfortable the accommodations, my business was suffering. Clients were losing patience with my vague explanations, and my entire life had been put on indefinite hold because Adrian Valenti had decided I needed protection. When he appeared in the study doorway around 8, I didn't bother with polite greetings. "How much longer?" He entered slowly, closing the door behind him. Tonight he'd forgone the usual suit, wearing just dark slacks and a white shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. It made him look younger, more human, and somehow more dangerous. "We're making progress. Another week, possibly 2. 2 more weeks." I stood, anger finally breaking free. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to my life? I have clients threatening to blacklist me, vendors who won't work with me anymore because I'm unreliable, a business I've spent 3 years building that's crumbling because you've decided I need to be locked away in the Hamptons." "You're alive," he said, echoing the argument from our first conversation here. "Your business can be rebuilt. Your life can't. That's not your decision to make. You don't get to unilaterally decide what risks I'm allowed to take with my own existence. When those risks involve my organization and threats I'm responsible for managing, yes, I do. This isn't about your organization. This is about control." I moved toward him, propelled by 2 weeks of accumulated frustration. "You want to control who I see, where I go, what risks I take, just like you controlled those events I coordinated, just like you control everything in your world. You think this is about control?" Adrian's composure was cracking. I could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the hardness in his eyes. "You think I enjoy having you here, knowing you resent every moment, watching you look at me like I'm your captor instead of your protection? Then let me leave. Let me make my own choices and deal with my own consequences." "No." He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, and suddenly we were standing inches apart, his height and presence overwhelming in the small space. "You don't understand what they would do to you. What Julian and the Carbone organization have planned. You're not just a target for information anymore, Claire. You're a statement, a message they want to send about what happens when someone interferes with their operations." "I didn't interfere with anything. I was just trying to live my life, and you—" My voice broke slightly. "You warned me about Julian, and I should have listened. But that doesn't give you the right to lock me away indefinitely." "I know." His voice dropped, some of the anger bleeding out. "I know this isn't fair. I know you didn't ask for any of this, but I can't let you go back to being vulnerable. Can't let you walk into danger just because you're frustrated with being protected." "Why do you even care this much?" I demanded, hating how my voice shook. "I'm nobody to you, just an event coordinator who happened to get caught up in your world. Vincent said it himself. I'm consuming resources you need elsewhere. So why are you doing this? You think you're nobody to me?" Adrian's hand came up, fingers gripping my arm with just enough pressure to keep me from backing away. "You think I coordinate personal protection details for random contractors? You think I upend operations and redirect security because of professional obligation? Then what is this? What am I to you? You're the person I've watched at every event for 6 months. The words came out rough, like they'd been locked away too long. The person whose attention I tried to avoid because I knew getting closer would be dangerous. The person who smiled at vendors and calmed difficult clients and made everything run smoothly while thinking no one important was paying attention. I was paying attention, Claire. To everything. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. You never said anything. You barely looked at me, because looking at you made me want things I couldn't afford to want. Because I learned from Gabriella that people close to me die, and I wasn't willing to put another person at risk just because I found myself thinking about her when I should have been focused on business. His grip on my arm loosened, but didn't release. And then Julian appeared, and I watched him charm you. Watched you smile at him the way I wanted you to smile at me, and I nearly lost control. The night at the gallery, I whispered. When he kissed me, I wanted to kill him. Right there in front of everyone, I wanted to make him disappear for touching what I'd been denying myself. Adrian's free hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing my cheekbone. That's when I knew I couldn't maintain distance anymore. That's when I became dangerous to you in a completely different way. The intensity in his dark eyes stole my breath. This was what I'd sensed beneath all our interactions. The thing I'd been too afraid to name. Not just protection or professional concern, but want. Possession. Something that had been building since long before I'd noticed. Adrian! Thunder cracked overhead, and the mansion's lights flickered once before steadying. But the storm had arrived in full force now, rain hammering the windows with enough violence to drown out thought. Then the alarm began shrieking. Adrian's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. His hands left me, one going to the gun I hadn't known he was carrying, the other grabbing my wrist with bruising force. Basement. Now. No room for argument, no explanation. Just immediate command. He pulled me through the study door and toward the back of the house, Vincent appearing from somewhere with weapon drawn, 3 other security personnel converging from different directions. The organized chaos suggested this was a scenario they'd drilled, a threat they'd prepared for. How many? Adrian demanded, still pulling me toward a door I'd never noticed before. 6 confirmed approaching from the east perimeter. 2 more cutting power to the backup generators. Vincent's voice was clipped, professional. Coordinated assault, Carbone signatures all over it. Get her to the vault. Lock it down. Nobody opens that door except me, understood? Boss, you should go with her. I need to handle this. Go! Adrian wrenched open the basement door, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked on, casting everything in harsh red shadows. He pulled me down the stairs at a speed that had me stumbling, his grip the only thing keeping me upright. At the bottom was another door, steel and serious, with a biometric lock. Adrian pressed his palm to the scanner, and it opened with a heavy click, revealing a small room maybe 10 feet square. Concrete walls, reinforced ceiling, a single bench, and nothing else except a radio mounted to the wall. Stay here. Don't open this door for anyone except me. If I'm not back in 2 hours, use the radio. Channel 7. They'll know what to do. Adrian, wait. But he was already backing toward the stairs. Then I heard it. Gunfire. Sharp cracks that echoed through the mansion above us, followed by shouting and the crash of breaking glass. Lock it behind me, Adrian commanded. And then he was gone, the door swinging shut with a finality that made my chest constrict. I engaged the lock with shaking hands, hearing it seal with multiple mechanisms clicking into place. Then I was alone in the small concrete room, the muffled sounds of violence filtering through the ceiling, and terror unlike anything I'd experienced flooding through me. More gunfire. Sustained this time, multiple weapons creating a symphony of destruction. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down to sit on the cold floor, arms wrapped around my knees, trying to control breathing that wanted to spiral into hyperventilation. This was real. People were attacking the mansion, trying to get to me or to Adrian or to whatever strategic objective the Carbone organization had decided was worth this level of violence. And Adrian was up there, in the middle of it, while I was locked in a concrete box, unable to help or even know what was happening. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. The gunfire continued in bursts, sometimes close enough that I could hear distinct shots, sometimes distant enough to be almost abstract. Footsteps thundered overhead, running, searching, fighting. Then silence fell, so sudden and complete it was worse than the noise. I stared at the locked door, straining to hear anything, my imagination filling the void with increasingly terrible scenarios. Adrian dead. Everyone dead. The Carbone people finding the vault and waiting for me to eventually have to emerge. My watch showed 47 minutes since Adrian had locked me in here. 47 minutes that felt like days. Then I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate, descending toward the vault door. I pressed myself further against the wall, as if the extra 6 inches would make any difference. My heart hammering so hard I felt lightheaded. The biometric lock beeped. Once, twice. Then the mechanisms began disengaging, and the door swung open to reveal Adrian. He was alive, standing, but his white shirt was stained dark with blood, his face smudged with smoke or dirt, exhaustion etched in every line of his body. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. Then I was moving, crossing the small space and throwing my arms around him without thought. He caught me, one arm wrapping around my waist, the other hand coming up to cradle the back of my head, and I felt him shaking. "It's not my blood," he said quietly against my hair. "I'm not hurt. Are they gone?" "Yes. Dead or captured. Vincent's securing the property now." I pulled back just enough to look at his face, my hands framing his jaw. There was a cut above his left eyebrow I hadn't noticed before, still bleeding slightly, and the exhaustion in his dark eyes went beyond physical. I thought, my voice broke. When it went quiet, I thought they'd gotten you. I told you I'd come back. His hand was still in my hair, fingers tangled in the strands like he needed the anchor. I almost went insane thinking about you down here alone, terrified, while I was dealing with them. All I wanted was to get back to you, to make sure you were safe. The confession hung between us, raw and unguarded. This wasn't the controlled Don who ran criminal operations with calculated precision. This was a man who'd just fought to protect something he couldn't afford to lose, and the mask had finally shattered completely. I kissed him. Didn't plan it, didn't think about consequences or complications, just acted on the overwhelming need to confirm we were both alive and here and real. His response was immediate and desperate, his mouth claiming mine with an intensity that stole whatever breath I had left. We stayed like that for a long moment, standing in the doorway of the concrete vault while chaos still echoed somewhere above us, holding onto each other like the world was ending, and this was all we had left. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against mine. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know. You're not safe here anymore. They found this location, which means nowhere connected to me is secure for you. So what happens now? Now I make sure they never threaten you again." His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, something cold and final. "And then we figure out what this is between us and whether you can forgive me for dragging you into my world." Thunder continued rolling overhead, the storm still raging. But inside the vault the air felt charged with something different. Fear transmuting into possibility, danger reshaping into promise, and the careful distance we'd maintained burning away in the reality of almost losing each other. Whatever came next, we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and standing there with Adrian's blood-stained shirt pressed against me and his heartbeat steady beneath my palm, I found I didn't want to go back. The aftermath of the attack became a blur of law enforcement interviews, damage assessment, and strategic meetings I wasn't invited to, but could hear happening throughout the mansion. Adrian had 4 of the attackers in custody, 2 dead on the property, and enough evidence of Carbone organization involvement to build a case that apparently interested people far more powerful than either family. The FBI has been investigating the Carbones for money laundering for 18 months, Vincent explained to me 3 days after the assault, his tone more respectful than it had been before. They have most of the financial trail but needed operational intelligence to make arrests stick. Mr. Valenti is offering them exactly that. In exchange for what? Immunity on certain business activities. protection for key personnel. Vincent's gaze was steady. And a guarantee that you won't be touched by any remaining Carbone associates once this goes public. I should have asked more questions about what certain business activities meant, should have pressed for details about the deal Adrian was negotiating with federal authorities. But I was too exhausted, too wrung out from fear and adrenaline crash to care about moral complexities. Adrian was handling it. That had to be sufficient. I didn't see him much during those first days. He was constantly on the phone, meeting with lawyers and federal prosecutors, coordinating with Vincent about securing other properties and personnel. When we did cross paths, the intensity from that moment in the vault hung between us, acknowledged but not discussed. 2 weeks after the attack, Vincent found me working in the study and announced that Julian Hale had been arrested in a coordinated federal operation. 3 senior Carbone organization leaders had been taken into custody simultaneously, charged with money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. "It's over?" I asked, not quite believing it could be that simple. "The immediate threat, yes. The Carbone organization will be crippled by these arrests, and the remaining members won't risk further action against Mr. Valenti's interests." Vincent actually smiled slightly. "You can go home, Miss Wells." Home. My studio apartment in Brooklyn that I hadn't seen in over 2 weeks. My business that I'd been managing through spotty internet and apologetic emails. My life that had been suspended while I hid in the Hamptons. Except when I tried to imagine returning to that existence, picking up exactly where I'd left off. It felt wrong. Like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. Adrian appeared in the study that evening, looking less exhausted than he had in days. The cut above his eyebrow had healed to a thin line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "Vincent said you told me I could leave." "You can. The threat's been neutralized, and you're free to return to your life." He moved to stand near the fireplace, maintaining that careful distance we'd reverted to since the kiss. "But before you do, I want to offer you something." I waited, watching him choose his words with the same precision he applied to everything. "I own several legitimate properties in Manhattan. The Celestine Hotel near Times Square, Marcello's restaurant in the Meatpacking District, the Ashford Gallery in Chelsea. They all require event coordination for corporate functions, private parties, charity galas. The kind of work you already do, but with better resources and consistent income. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a position managing events across all 3 properties. Salary significantly above what you're currently earning as a freelancer, full benefits, and complete separation from any business activities you'd find objectionable." His dark eyes met mine. "Real work, Claire. Legitimate work. No gray areas, no looking the other way, just coordinating events for profitable businesses." "Why would you do that?" "Because you're talented at what you do, and I need someone I can trust in that role." He paused. "And because I want you to have options that don't involve struggling under debt or taking whatever clients you can find just to survive." It was a generous offer, suspiciously generous, and I should have been wary of strings attached. But the prospect of steady income, of finally being able to make real progress on my student loans without constantly hustling for new clients, was too compelling to dismiss. "I need to think about it." "Of course. Take whatever time you need." I returned to Brooklyn 3 days later, stepping back into my studio apartment that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. But I'd changed in the weeks away, and the space no longer felt like home so much as a reminder of who I'd been before Adrian Valenti had entered my life. My business had suffered during my absence, but not as catastrophically as I'd feared. Several clients had found other coordinators, a few vendor relationships had soured, but the core of what I'd built remained intact. I could rebuild from here if I wanted to. The question was whether I wanted to. Adrian's offer sat in my email inbox, formal and detailed, outlining salary expectations and responsibilities that were genuinely reasonable. I read through it multiple times, looking for the trap, the hidden control mechanism, the way this would bind me to his world in ways I couldn't escape. But it seemed legitimate. Corporate event management for profitable businesses, work I was already qualified for, at a salary that would let me finally breathe financially. I accepted the position a week after returning to Brooklyn. The onboarding process was surprisingly professional. HR paperwork, tax forms, orientation at each of the 3 properties I'd be managing events for. The hotel was elegant and well-maintained. The restaurant had a Michelin star and a waiting list for reservations, and the gallery featured contemporary artists whose work actually sold for impressive prices. This was real. Adrian hadn't been exaggerating when he'd said these were legitimate operations. My first month in the new role was intense, but satisfying in ways freelancing had never been. I had resources, staff who reported to me, budgets that didn't require constant penny pinching. The events I coordinated were high-profile and smoothly executed, and for the first time in years, I went home after work without the constant anxiety about whether I'd have sufficient income next month. And the salary was genuinely generous. After taxes and rent and necessary expenses, I was able to put significant amounts toward my student loan debt. For the first time since graduating, I could see a realistic path to being completely free of that burden. 6 months into the position, I made my final loan payment. $43,000, finally cleared. The weight that had pressed on my shoulders for years lifted, and I sat in my Brooklyn apartment staring at the confirmation email with tears running down my face. I was free. Actually, genuinely free of the debt that had shaped every decision I'd made since college. Adrian had texted me occasionally during those 6 months. Professional check-ins about how the position was working out, whether I needed additional resources or support. We'd seen each other a handful of times at events I coordinated that he attended, maintaining careful politeness and distance. But the night I cleared my final loan payment, my phone rang with his number. "Vincent mentioned you seemed emotional at work today. Is everything all right? I paid off my student loans, all of them. I'm completely debt-free for the first time since I was 22. Silence on the other end. Then his voice, warm with genuine pleasure. "Claire, that's incredible. Congratulations. It wouldn't have been possible without this job, without you giving me this opportunity." I wiped at my eyes. "So thank you. Really. You earned it through your work. I just provided the platform." He paused. "Are you celebrating? Because you should be celebrating." I'm sitting alone in my apartment eating takeout and crying, so not exactly festive. That's unacceptable. I'm sending a car. We're having dinner, proper dinner, to mark the occasion. Before I could protest, he'd already ended the call. 40 minutes later, a black car pulled up outside my building, and I found myself being driven to a restaurant in Midtown that I'd read about, but never imagined being able to afford. Adrian was waiting at a private table, wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than a month of my old freelance income. And when he stood to greet me, his expression held warmth I hadn't seen since that night in the vault. "To financial freedom," he said, raising his wine glass once we'd ordered. One of the most underrated forms of power. Dinner stretched for hours, conversation flowing easily in a way it hadn't since the Hamptons. He asked about my work at the 3 properties, seemed genuinely interested in the events I'd coordinated and the challenges I'd navigated. I found myself telling him about a particularly difficult client situation I'd resolved, a vendor dispute I'd mediated, the small triumphs that made this job satisfying beyond just the paycheck. "You're thriving," he observed, something like pride in his voice. "I knew you would, but seeing it confirmed is gratifying." I'm still living in Brooklyn, though. Same studio apartment, same neighborhood. Is that a problem? It's not the safest area. And after everything that happened with Julian and the Carbones, I'm probably more paranoid about security than I should be. Adrian's expression shifted, became more serious. I've wanted to address that, actually. There's an apartment available in one of my buildings in the Upper West Side. 2-bedroom, modern security, doorman. It would be safer. Adrian, I can't afford Upper West Side rent, even with my new salary. The rent would be substantially reduced for employees in management positions. Think of it as part of your benefits package. I should have said no. Should have maintained the independence I'd worked so hard to build. But the truth was, I did feel vulnerable in Brooklyn. Did worry every time I came home late, or heard unfamiliar sounds in the hallway. How reduced are we talking? Whatever you're paying now in Brooklyn. That's not market rate, that's charity. It's pragmatic security allocation. His dark eyes held mine. I sleep better knowing people important to my operations are safely housed. Let me do this, Claire. Please. The apartment in the Upper West Side was beautiful, far nicer than anything I could have afforded on my own. Large windows overlooking the street, updated kitchen, actual separation between bedroom and living space. I moved in 3 weeks later, leaving behind the Brooklyn studio that had witnessed my years of struggle. And Adrian started appearing more frequently in my life. Not at work. He was careful about that, maintaining professional boundaries at the properties I managed. But he'd text asking if I wanted dinner, would appear at my building with takeout from places I mentioned wanting to try, would invite me to his penthouse a few floors above my apartment for drinks and conversation that stretched late into the night. We never discussed what we were doing, never put labels on the time we spent together. But it felt like courtship, slow and deliberate, building something neither of us wanted to rush or risk breaking with premature definition. Vincent noticed, of course. I ran into him at the hotel one afternoon, and he actually smiled when he saw me. "You're good for him," he said without preamble. "Adrian's different now, more human, less consumed by the weight of everything. I'm not doing anything special. You're existing in his life without demanding he be anything other than what he is. That's rarer than you think." Vincent's expression turned serious. "I was wrong about you initially. Thought you were a complication we couldn't afford. I'm glad I was wrong." 8 months after accepting the position, on a night when rain fell soft and steady over Manhattan, Adrian texted asking me to meet him on the rooftop of our building. I found him standing near the edge, the city spread out below us like a carpet of light, rain creating halos around every street lamp and window. He turned when he heard me approach, and something in his expression made my breath catch. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months," he began, moving to stand directly in front of me, trying to find the right words, the right moment, the right way to explain what you've become to me. "Adrian, let me finish." His hands came up to frame my face, thumbs brushing my cheekbones. "When you walked into that first event at the plaza, you were nobody to me, just another contractor, another functionally invisible person who kept my world running smoothly. I didn't see you, didn't notice you, didn't care. That's not exactly romantic," I managed, though my heart was pounding. "But then I did notice. Started paying attention to the way you handled chaos with calm efficiency, the way you treated everyone with the same respect regardless of their position, the way you existed in my world without being corrupted or diminished by it, and you stopped being nobody and became someone I couldn't stop thinking about." The rain fell harder, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was Adrian's dark eyes locked on mine, the intensity in his expression, the way his hands trembled slightly against my face. "You meant nothing to me," he said quietly. "Until you meant absolutely everything." He kissed me then, deep and claiming, tasting like rain and promise, and all the weeks of careful distance finally burning away. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pressing closer, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady against my chest. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the city lights blurred through rain and emotion. "I don't know what we are," I admitted. "I don't know how this works, being with you while working for you, while trying to maintain some kind of normal life. We figure it out together," Adrian said, resting his forehead against mine. "No more careful distance, no more pretending this isn't what we both want. Just us, building something real from all this chaos. That sounds terrifying." "Probably." He smiled, and it transformed his face into something younger, more open. "But you've already survived being targeted by a rival organization and attacked in the Hamptons. I think you can handle the relatively simple challenge of being with me." I laughed, despite everything. Despite the rain and the uncertainty and the complicated reality of loving someone like Adrian Valenti. Because that's what this was, I realized. Love, messy and unexpected and born from circumstances that should have destroyed us but somehow hadn't. We stayed on that rooftop for a long time, rain falling around us, the city bearing witness to promises we didn't need to speak aloud. My life had been simple once, defined by debt and survival, and the grinding daily work of staying afloat. Now it was complicated, dangerous in ways I still didn't fully understand. Tied to a man whose world operated by rules I was still learning. But it was mine. Chosen rather than inflicted. built from ashes of who I'd been into something I was still becoming. And standing there with Adrian's arms around me and Manhattan glowing below, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not the safe one, not the simple one, but the one that felt true in a way nothing else ever had. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. That would have to be everything.